The Dark Half, like many of Stephen King's novels, is semi-autobiographical, but the real-life incident that inspired this particular book was, of course, just where the idea for The Dark Half began. What the story evolved into from there, however, involves everything from Greek mythology, psychic connections, and bizarre anatomical anomalies, all of which culminate into a story that is quintessentially Stephen King. Hi there, I'm your host, Mr. Doyle, and this is a great undertaking. If you're a fan of Stephen King's scary stories and siblings absorbing their weaker twin in utero in a microscopic battle to the death, please consider giving this video a like and subscribing to the channel. This is the first of 2 videos in my series for The Dark Half. In this video, we will be discussing Stephen King's 1989 novel, and in the second video, we will be checking out the 1993 feature-length film adaptation, which was directed by the legendary George Romero. The Dark Half was King's final publication of the 1980s, which was the decade in which he truly defined and established himself as a literary force of nature. And so he had to see to it that his final contribution to this era of his career was something only he could have dreamt up. And in fact, he didn't have to dream it up, at least not all of it, as it was based on events in his own life. But before we jump into the details regarding King's close relationship before we jump into the details regarding King's close relationship to the story and the story's protagonist, let's recap what The Dark Half is all about with a quick summary first. The Dark Half, a brief summary. Thad Beaumont is an author and also has the douchiest name imaginable. I mean, for real, Thad Beaumont sounds like the name of a guy with rich parents who used to beat kids up in school because they wore glasses, pledged Theta Kappa whatever the fuck, and majored in cocaine in college, and then went on to marry an obnoxious future dance mom, all while being the most popular asshole at the country club where everyone calls him the Thadiator. I mean, Thad Beaumont? That's the name you settled on, Stephen? Really? Anyway, Beaumont is an author who has been writing stories under the pseudonym George Stark. Stark's novels are violent, bloody, and intense, a far cry from what Beaumont himself has been publishing. Stark's novels have garnered a rabid fan base and an unanticipated level of acclaim beyond that of Beaumont's novels. When one day it all comes crashing down, Beaumont's cover is blown, but rather than let some conniving journalist expose his alter ego, Beaumont opts to do it himself and comes clean in an article of People magazine. But when he tries to put his pen name to rest, he comes to find that Stark isn't willing to go quietly. Stark manifests as a real flesh and blood man, and he's out to get revenge on everyone involved in his untimely demise. Stark terrorizes and takes down everyone that gets in his way as he cuts a bloody path to Beaumont and his family. Time is of the essence, and the only way Stark can maintain his newfound physical form is by forcing Beaumont to write a new Stark novel, and by taking over Beaumont's life one chapter at a time. History and inspiration. As most Stephen King fans know, King published a number of novels under the pen name Richard Bachman. I've covered the first 5 Bachman books, Rage, The Long Walk, Road Work, The Running Man, and Thinner, already on this channel. So check out my Bachman Books playlist if you're not familiar with those novels. Anyway, like the protagonist of The Dark Half, and in a similar fashion, King's alter ego was exposed, and as a result, the pseudonym was retired. Although, unlike Thad Beaumont, King would go on to publish a couple more novels using the Bachman name following the premature outing of his identity. In his rewritten second introduction to the consolidated Bachman books entitled The Importance of Being Bachman, King discusses the Bachman persona and his reaction to Bachman's true identity being revealed, as well as how the entire situation inspired The Dark Half. King states, quote, "He took on his own reality, that's all, and when his cover was blown, he died. I made light of this in the few interviews I felt required to give on the subject, saying that Richard Bachman had died of cancer of the pseudonym, but it was actually shock that killed him. The realization that sometimes people just won't let you alone. Put another way, Bachman was the vampirish side of my existence, killed by the sunlight of disclosure. My feelings about all this were confused enough and fertile enough to bring on a book, a Stephen King book that is, The Dark Half. It was about a writer whose pseudonym, George Stark, actually comes to life. It's a book my wife has always hated, perhaps because for Thad Beaumont, the dream of being a writer overwhelms the reality of being a man. For Thad, delusive thinking overtakes rationality completely with horrific consequences." Unquote. The whole story of how Bachman's true identity was exposed is interesting, and I've left a link below for anyone who would like to check out the entire series of events, as well as how Richard Bachman came to be. I've also linked the entire The Importance of Being Bachman text for those of you who want to read more about King's thoughts on the matter. The sparrows are flying again. In The Dark Half, Beaumont sees and hears flocks of sparrows throughout the novel. At the beginning of the story, when he was a child, he heard the sparrows as a sort of premonitory warning or indicator of an oncoming debilitating headache, the cause of which at the time had yet to be discovered. The sparrow sounds were a sort of auditory hallucination caused by what was at first suspected to be a tumor in young Beaumont's brain. But during exploratory surgery, it was discovered that Beaumont had, in fact, absorbed a twin while in the womb, and pieces of that twin wound up in his cranium, and we'll get more into that later. But after the removal of the brotherly brain matter, Thad's headaches and the sparrow sounds ceased. We eventually learn that following the surgery that excised Stark from Beaumont's cerebellum, the hospital was dive-bombed by hundreds, perhaps thousands of sparrows, and it is at the story's climax that the sparrows return to tear Stark apart and carry his soul back to the spirit realm from which he was unnaturally birthed forth. So, it seems that the sparrows come and go with Stark, even when he started off as a cluster of partially developed random body parts lodged in Beaumont's 11-year-old brain. The sparrows were there, and they remain explicitly tied to Stark's presence, to Stark's existence throughout the novel. But these sparrows are more than a flock of airborne harbingers. They are what is known as psychopomps. Psychopomps are best described as supernatural creatures that guide souls to the land of the dead. The word psychopomp originated in ancient Greek mythology. However, stories and folk tales of psychopomps were and still are prominent across many cultures, religions, and civilizations. In some cultures, psychopomps are the ghosts of their ancestors. In others, they are anthropomorphic entities, animals, angels, gods, and even birds, such as ravens, crows, and sparrows. The psychopomp is seen as a sort of mediator between the conscious and unconscious realms, one who is sent not to pass judgment, but to guide and escort the souls of the dead to whatever alternate plane of existence awaits them. In addition to the Bachman debacle, or the debaclement, King was clearly inspired by this ancient belief in and religious use of spirit guides, and in regards to how psychopomps found their way into his novel, King states on his website, quote, "I thought it would be fun to write a story about a novelist whose muse gets totally out of control. There was only one problem. I didn't know how to end it. Then one day while I was on the way to my office, I saw a huge flock of crows, huge enough to darken an appreciable part of the sky, all take wing at once. They made me think of a poem by H.P. Lovecraft called The Psychopomp, about a bird who is an emissary of death and a winged messenger between the land inhabited by mortals and that of the afterlife. In that instant, I knew exactly how to dispose of George Stark. All I had to do was go home and write it." Unquote. So King admits to borrowing the idea of the psychopomps appearing as birds directly from Lovecraft, but the psychopomp had a long history in storytelling, folklore, and mythology that was around long before Lovecraft incorporated the idea into his canon. Alright, so pseudonyms, psychopomps, those are two of the three things I wanted to discuss in this video. And this third and final topic is perhaps the most fascinating and equally disturbing subject of them all. Eternal twins. So, when Thad starts having his headaches and seizures as a child and they open up his head to remove what the surgeon assumes is a tumor, they instead find an eyeball, some teeth, and even some fingernails. Gross. According to the surgeon, Thad likely absorbed his twin while the two were gestating, and the misplaced appendages were that of the absorbed fetus. That got me wondering about what the possibility of something like that happening in real life was, and if there were any actual recorded cases of this bizarre, incomplete absorption of a twin leading to both unforeseen health complications for the surviving child and consequently resulting in grisly scenes like the one depicted in The Dark Half. And yeah, while King's grotesque portrayal is perhaps more outlandish than reality, it's not entirely off base or wildly inaccurate when compared to some actual occurrences. But let's start with a far more common, natural, yet still somewhat unsettling occurrence known as vanishing twin syndrome. According to Jeffrey A. Culler, MD, professor of obstetrics and gynecology in the Division of Maternal Fetal Medicine at Duke University School of Medicine, that's a long-ass title, in a 2017 article for Romper.com, quote, "A vanishing twin is when a fetus in a multi-fetal pregnancy dies in utero in the early first trimester. Over the course of the pregnancy, it typically is resorbed. If it happens early, the twin completely disappears." Unquote. Here's where it gets a bit wild, though. According to Culler, it is typically the mother who resorbs the embryo cells and not the other fetus. However, it has happened with some truly astounding results. The Romper article goes on to say this, quote, "In extremely rare cases, the deceased embryo cells are absorbed by the surviving twin. Under these conditions, the remaining fetus becomes a chimera, or a person with two sets of DNA, according to Scientific American. Under this set of conditions, a person could go through life with two different blood types. For example, a woman preparing for a kidney transplant was identified as genetically different from her own biological children, a fact that caused some confusion until her chimerism was discovered, according to the New England Journal of Medicine. She had absorbed a twin's DNA in utero, but the children she delivered were definitely hers." Unquote. That's crazy. Two sets of DNA. So yeah, the absorption of a twin or multiple twins isn't all that uncommon, at least not when it comes to multifetal pregnancies, and rarely are there any visible telltale signs on the surviving baby or the mother. But what about when there are? The headline from an article in ABC News published in February of 2015 reads, "Baby girl born with possible absorbed twins inside her." But what this article describes is nothing even remotely as horrific as what happens in the dark half. The article by ABC News describes this discovery of the absorbed twins as follows. Quote, "The mass was between the girl's liver and left kidney, and it included two partially formed fetus-like structures, one weighing half an ounce and the other weighing a third of an ounce." Unquote. So while it's fascinating and certainly atypical, it's not eyeballs in the brain levels of bonkers, but it is incredibly rare for this sort of anomaly to occur. All of this led me down quite the rabbit hole, and I found myself reading about conjoined twins, craniofacial duplication, and other extremely rare, often extremely unfortunate conditions. However, I wasn't able to find anything quite like what King described in his story. The closest I came was this one absolutely wild article that reads, quote, "A Colombian woman has given birth to a baby whose abdomen contained the tiny, half-formed, but still growing body of her own twin sister." And after I read that, I mean, there has to be a case of someone with eyeballs in their brain and shit. God, pregnancy and the creation of humans and all the bizarre things that can happen, the intricacies of the formation and functionality of the human body. That last one, the baby growing within a baby, that's incredibly rare, but it's also estimated to occur in approximately 1 out of every 500,000 pregnancies. So if there are 8 billion people on this planet, that's like approximately 16,000 fetuses that just have other fetuses growing inside them. Oh my God. The human body is capable of doing some unpredictable things, so maybe Thad Beaumont's situation isn't all that unbelievable after all. All right, I think I've plumbed the depths of this particular topic far enough. I'm tapping out now. Final thoughts. Well, that was something. To be honest, The Dark Half isn't among my favorite King stories, but the background and what inspired the story, I find that to all be particularly interesting. The Bachman ordeal, Psychopomps' bizarre instances of fetuses absorbing their womb mates. Get it? See what I did there? Womb mates instead of roommates. I'll see myself out. In my next video, I'll be checking out the 1993 screen adaptation of The Dark Half. Despite his indisputable legendary status, Romero films can vary wildly in quality, and so, as usual, I'm maintaining a level of cautious optimism and mild skepticism for this movie. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like and consider subscribing to the channel. Thanks to all my subs and constant commenters for leaving your thoughts in the comments sections of all of my videos. I appreciate your time and your contributions to this channel. I'll see you in a couple of weeks. Okay, goodbye. Be sure to click like and subscribe to the channel for my continued analysis of all things Stephen King, pretty pleased with blood and guts on top. My name is Mr. Doyle, and this has been a great undertaking.